So I thought tonight we could talk about the cause of suffering, sort of a grandiose title, right? But I think when we really investigate it, we can come to find that there is a fundamental cause. You know, we can, of course, find lots of precipitating events, um, lots of reactivity, lots of rights and wrongs and shoulds and shouldn'ts, all of which has the potential to cause suffering. So we could deal with it on that level, on that psychological level, but let's not. let's try to get to the root of it and see what's actually operating here. So the suffering that we're talking about is sort of the fundamental characteristics of human life, the discovery of which by the Buddha sort of sent him off from his life of luxury out into the woods to try to figure out the resolution of that. You know, what is, you know, after being shocked by the presence in life of birth, life, and death, he sought to find some resolution to that. Is that all there is to life? Ultimately, sense of suffering, or is there some exit door there that is possible to be found? So the term in Buddhism that's generally translated as suffering is dukkha, but it doesn't just mean abject misery. It's a much broader term than that. Of course, it can include a sense of misery, but it can also include just a sense of unsatisfactoriness or sort of vague anxiety or feeling not quite at home in the world or in our skin, or there's a sense of restlessness or something not being quite right. So when we use the term suffering tonight, we'll just include that whole broad range of possibilities. So in Buddhism, they talk about, you know, one of the characteristics of human life that can lead to suffering is impermanence, right? So this shouldn't be a big surprise to any of us. We can look around and see that everything that has form is impermanent. Everything that has form is in a process of change. You know, some things more quickly than others, but everything is in a process of change. You know, whether we're talking about, you know, a plant or a bird or a mountain or a star or a human being or, you know, morning glory flower in the morning, you know, all subject to change, different rates of change, but the fact of change is inevitable, right? So we can acknowledge that, but rather than interpret like, oh, what an unfortunate thing about life that it has this characteristic of impermanence, we can also see that without impermanence, life itself is impossible, right? You know, without the possibility of change, you know, the acorn would never grow into an oak tree. The caterpillar would never become a butterfly. You know, us as children would never have become adults. So we can see that there are, you know, some forms of impermanence that we don't mind at all. You know, we didn't, growing up, we didn't, you know, as difficult as that journey through teenagehood was, and, you know, adulthood still is, you know, we wouldn't choose to remain as children for our whole life, for example. Um, if we're in a sort of an endlessly boring meeting, we don't mind when the meeting comes to an end, right? So some kind of impermanence is just fine with us. So what we're really talking about is the kind of impermanence that that we don't like, right? That's what we're really talking about. So it's uh, this sense of impermanence. It's sort of how it is related to us, right? The change, for one person might feel one way, for another person might feel another way. Um, if something really calamitous happens to us, we certainly have a different relationship to it than the exact same event happening to an acquaintance, right? I mean, there we may still have empathy, but we don't react to it with the same level of suffering and projection, etc. So this sense of um, sort of reacting to change that we don't like um, has very much to do with how that change affects us as individuals personally, right? So now we're getting a little more to the heart of things. So it's not just impermanence as a concept, as a consequence of life itself, um, because like we say, the impermanence is necessary for the cycles of life, for life to continuously move and evolve. So it's an essential part of life itself, not just an unfortunate aspect to it. Um, but when we relate to it personally, how change or impermanence affects us personally, um, then we're sort of getting closer to the heart of the matter. So part of that is we, as humans feel um, vulnerable, right? Things, could be a physical threat to us, or probably more commonly a psychological threat to us. There's probably somewhere in our DNA that memory of being back, our ancestors being back on the savannah in Africa when we weren't really anywhere near the top of the list of predator species, the apex predators. We were sort of well down that list. So there's still some memory of being vulnerable in that sense. And that vulnerability shows up as, trying to protect ourselves from that sense of being challenged by change. So this resistance to change is really what is causing us to suffer. The change will happen, right? The change, whatever it is, by whatever event. But then this resistance is sort of our personal stance, for or against what's happening. So there's sort of life evolving, and then it's our personal, positioning ourselves, sort of taking a stance, a physical stance of whether we welcome that change or whether we're resisting that change. And the degree to which we are resisting the change is the degree to which we suffer, right? If there's no resistance, there's no suffering. You could almost say that suffering is how we feel when we are in opposition to life. So this resistance that we have, it's really, this whole sense of personal self is founded on resistance. Um, when there's not resistance to what's happening, the idea of a personal self sort of diminishes. It doesn't, it's not in the forefront. But when something really challenges us or threatens us, either psychologically or physically or health-wise, um, then the personal self can sort of rise up, sort of, all inflamed and get into a mode of reactivity, which results in this sort of enlarged sense of self. So the sense of self is very much has to do with the degree to which we're resisting change, change that we don't like. Okay, so this is similar to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross had these 5 stages of grief. When we're suddenly confronted with maybe serious illness. And she talks about these 5 stages as, denial, like, oh, I don't believe it, it couldn't happen, not to me. Or anger, and then we try to negotiate, I promise, to be good from here on out, if I can just get by this one time. And then there's sort of depression as the weight of the inevitability of that change sets in. And then hopefully at some point there's an acceptance of what's happening. So five stages of after we are confronted with challenging change of circumstances. But the only question is how quickly we get through the 5 stages, right? You might still sense into those, 5 stages moving through when we're, first faced with a challenging issue. But the question is, how fast do we move through them? I mean, is it never? Or is it years or months or weeks or days or hours? Or is it just seconds? So the degree to which we're hanging on to our resistance to what's happening has very much to do with the degree to which we suffer. All right. So let's clarify 2 terms, pain and suffering. So normally they're just equated, they're almost hyphenated, pain and suffering, right? I think sometimes it's in legal brief, someone sustained pain and suffering, right? But let's define them to try to tease apart a difference. Pain is a particular sensation. If we slam our thumb in the car door, it just plain hurts, right? That's pain. If we get an emotional blow, that can be pain. If a dear friend suddenly dies, that can, just be felt as just raw grief. So that's pain. Suffering is what we tell ourselves about the pain, right? Suffering is a mental activity. Pain can be physical, pain can be unavoidable. Suffering is optional. It's optional because it depends on the stories that we tell ourselves about the contributing event, the painful event, the challenging event. Right? So the stories that we tell ourselves about it can actually accentuate, our, cause us more emotional upset. And then, we can react to that. It can be sort of a self-feeding cycle, being fed by stories that we tell ourselves that we believe are true. Right? So if we find ourselves telling, something happens and, we can go into a whole litany of reactions like, I can't believe that happened. Why did it happen to me? Poor me, why me? They shouldn't have done that. I should have done something, we can, they're really to blame. I was really right. Whatever the storyline is, it has to do with arguing with whatever it was that's happened, right? Or we could just go global and, just say, this always happens to me. Life is unfair. God doesn't like me, right? Life sucks, whatever the sort of globalization of that, sort of self-contractive emotion is. Okay. But, it's not that such thoughts might not run through our mind. The only question and the option that we have is whether or not to believe the thoughts. We don't have the ability to control what thoughts arise in our mind. Be nice if we did, but we don't seem to have that capacity. But what we do have is the choice of whether to believe them or not to believe them. Just recognize them as, conditioned thoughts, reactivity. Okay. If we allow ourselves to act out of those thoughts, out of those reactive thoughts, then we just complicate things. We say things that we don't mean, we say things that we regret, we do things that we shouldn't, and those come around and cause us more suffering, So there's a way to perpetuate this by not really seeing to the heart of the matter. So when we look at this, it's really, the issue isn't really impermanence itself. It's really our resistance to impermanence when it shows up in a form that we don't like. Don't like with respect to who? With respect to me, right? That's what it generally comes down to. Whether, something that happens impacts me personally, we have a totally different reaction to it. So if we find out suddenly that, let's say, I lost my job, that has an immediate personal impact, a direct impact. If we find out that, the team that we were rooting for this weekend didn't win, it has sort of an indirect impact to our sense of well-being. Right? So what we're really talking about here is this sense within this body-mind of wanting to feel good about ourselves, wanting a sense of peace and equilibrium and joy. And so things that come our way, changes that enhance that, no problem. We like those, things that come our way that tend to diminish that sense. That's if we react to that, if we take them personally, then that generates suffering, right? Until we see through it, however long that may take. Okay, so when we say this sense of well-being, and things coming its way, what is this? What is this in service to? It's almost like, we strategize and organize our life to, improve the probability of things that are sort of self-enhancing, pleasurable to come our way, and hopefully try to avoid the things that aren't. But what is all of that in service to? Right? I mean, it's the body mind that experiences it, right? Experiences grief or joy or pain or ill health or injury or psychological hurt. The body mind has the ability to feel um, feel those things, but we somehow presume that there is a independent personal self entity there that we're sort of trying to protect, trying to give this sense of well-being and comfort and contentment, with minimal pain and loss. So in some sense, this whole effort and the sense of suffering is tied into suffering by whom. And this is where Ramana's directive comes in, find out, who am I? Ask yourself, who am I? Because it is really this imagined sense of a separate personal self that this whole movement of resistance and protection and suffering and avoiding suffering is really in service to this idea of me as a separate being, right? And so we can feel that any diminishment of that, psychological or physical, any diminishment of that sense of well-being is a threat to our very existence. So it feels critically important. So if we track back, we have impermanence as a general characteristic of life, and then we have impermanence as it affects a particular person, and then we have impermanence that we like and impermanence that we don't like, and the suffering caused by the resistance that we may maintain in opposition to the impermanence that we don't like, all in service to the sense of personal self, personal separate self-entity, right? So that we come to the sort of third leg in Buddhist philosophy of characteristics of life, right? Impermanence, suffering, and not self. Right? So if this movement from impermanence to suffering, to sort of taking it personally in service to the self, if there's not actually a self there, then what is all of this movement in service to? Right? So if we can truly see that, we can see that there is a possibility of the root cause being cut. If the root cause is our belief in a separate self, which is what our whole reactivity is, our whole sense of suffering in resistance to change that's detrimental somehow to this separate self. But if there's no separate self, where's the problem, right? It's not that the body will not still experience pain occasionally, probably, undoubtedly for all of us to a certain degree at certain times of our life. That seems inevitable. But the question of suffering, what we tell ourselves about the pain, if it is in service to protecting this concept that we were brought up to have, that what we are is separate, independent entities. If we find out that's not actually true, then the whole progression, the whole game comes to a sudden end. Right? So there are two ways we can go about investigating whether or not this uh, presumed sense of separate self exists or not. One way is, as Ramana suggested, just investigate it. If it's there, let's get a good look at it. Let's see where it is, where it originates from, etc. And when we actually go looking for it, we find it surprisingly difficult to pinpoint an origin, pinpoint a location where, yes, that is what I really am. That is when I say I, that's what I mean. That sense of separate, independent I. That's what's hard to find. What we do find is thoughts and dreams and fears and regrets and hopes and desires and unmet goals and guilts and all that other sort of debris left over from living this life, or what we may still be holding on to this moment. What we don't find is that personal self that is the thinker of these thoughts and the doer of our deeds, or doer of our actions, right? We presume that there must be someone there because there is thinking, no question. So we presume that there must be a thinker. And there's certainly doing that happens. So we presume that there must be an entity in there somewhere that is deciding to do this and not that, making decisions about how to act moment to moment. So fine, we can be like good scientists here. We can say, well, actually, I don't know the answer, so I'll just really research and look really closely and see if I can locate this thinker. We can locate thinking. We can locate doing. But what we're looking for is the thinker and the doer. The person in charge here. That's who we want to talk to. So that's Ramana's suggestion. Just inquire and look and see if we can find this entity. So we're not talking about a higher self. We're not talking about the parental voice in our head, that tells us, when we messed up, or, what we should do, or how we really should behave, or not that voice. That's just another thought stream in our head, right? So that's one way, just really examine that and look as hard as we possibly can for this personal self, right? To the point of exhaustion. What's left is real. What's left is what's always been living this life. But the suggestion is to approach it as a good scientist, right? Not one that, you believe, what the answer should be, but one that, is a genuine inquiry. I'm really going to get to the heart of it to find out if there's a personal self or not. And I'll start off by admitting that I don't know. Good place to start, especially if that's what's true. Okay, so that's one way. The other way is if we've had a glimpse of spacious awareness, is to just frequent that space as much as possible throughout the day, even a few minutes here, a few minutes there, longer if it works for you. And become just really familiar with that space, taking comfort from the fact that it is there present every time we stop to notice. It may not always be in the forefront. It's okay. Our attention may be outward, and then sometimes we pull the attention back. All of that's fine. But every time that we stop to check in, I wonder if I'm still aware like now, and just like we did at the beginning, just slow down. That's why I like to use the body, because the body can be accessed in a non-conceptual way. We can just look directly at perceptions or thoughts or feelings without the necessity to use the mind to analyze them. And we can just check in and see over and over and over again that awareness is present every time we care to notice. And over time, that'll give us just a greater and greater confidence in the solidity of that awareness as our fundamental identity. And from that perspective, there's still an intimacy with this body mind. We still are intimate with our thoughts. We still can sense the perceptions that the body is perceiving. All of that's still unchanged, but the perspective that we're viewing it from has changed. So when we're viewing it as a separate self, it almost feels like we're looking from inside outward, right? Is there that sense? Like that's the way my eyes look, right? They look outward. And it feels like I'm in here somehow, somewhere. I can't quite find where it is, but I'm sure it's in there somewhere. And I'm looking out at life, right? From the perspective of awareness, it feels different. It feels like I'm somehow a bit, you could say a bit beyond or above the body mind, but that the body mind is appearing within awareness, as is everything else. As is everything else. So this shift from imagining that the sort of locus of what we refer to as I happens in here somewhere, but without investigation, we find that either by investigation or by spending time in awareness, that we realize that what we've referred to as I actually is something greater than this body mind, right? Body mind happens within that awareness. All the thoughts, all the activities, all the sensations happen within that awareness that we already are. So that's the good news, that we haven't attained anything. We've just recognized what's already happening, right? So there's several reasons why this sort of shift of identity from believing that, what I am is limited to this body mind, what I'm perceiving is being perceived from some sort of headquarters located in this body mind, to recognizing not as a concept, but actually being irreversibly convinced that what we truly are is fundamentally this awareness. Okay, so there's several things. One is, this is what we were taught, right? We were taught, all of us, by people who believed that what they were was limited to this body mind. And that's what was conveyed. That's what our culture conveys. So it seems almost heretical, to say, well, maybe that's not actually true. But if we don't know that it's true, if we don't know for certain that um, the awareness um, that we're functioning from is not a product of the mind, of these brain cells, if we don't know that for sure, um, it's much better to leave it as an open question, like, I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not. Um, but it's a fundamentally interesting question. Is this awareness that is clearly present? We're all aware, all actually equally aware, all as aware as the big ones, right? The Buddhas and the Jesuses and etc. The awareness is as that, right? It's not the limitation of our awareness. It is the degree to which we have overburdened it with our concepts and ideas and um, opinions about how things are. But the awareness itself is in its original purity. So we don't have to improve awareness. We just have to um, really look and see what is primary here. Is it the body-mind that's primary and consciousness is a consequence of that? Or is the reverse true? Is that consciousness is primary and the body-mind occurs within consciousness? It's interesting to note that one of the fathers of quantum physics, Niels Bohr, um, said that consciousness is primary, that all form, all matter is derived from consciousness. This is the eminent quantum physicist. This is the perspective. Matter is the derivative of consciousness. Okay, so one reason that it's hard to sort of make this shift of identity is that we were taught otherwise for a long time. I mean, culture believes that. Another reason is that we can notice that we are aware of thoughts and perceptions happening in this body mind, but we're not aware of thoughts and perceptions happening in another body mind, right? So, the conclusion is, therefore, the awareness must be particular to this body mind, must be unique to it. That other one might have some awareness too, sort of a separate but equal awareness. But, these body minds as sensing organisms is how we experience life. I mean, it's how we receive perceptions and sensations. It has the capacity to think and to feel. All of that's true. And all of that's located here in this body. And it's processed by our brain and sorted out and interpreted, etc. And there's consciousness that notices that, right? So all of it's true up to the point that we presume that because consciousness is present to notice that, and the perceptions are, happening in the vicinity of this body mind, the presumption is therefore consciousness is being produced by this body mind. There's the fallacy, right? The implication is just by evidence of proximity that that we can conclude that there's a causal nature to the consciousness. But all we really know is that there is awareness that is present to notice um, this compilation of sensations in our mind, right? Um, there's also in all living organisms, there's this just this intense desire to survive, right? So, I mean, it's present even at a cellular level. Um, so this sense of existing is, there's a sense, there's an element of that that's tied up into this organism, you know, on a very cellular basis, the desire to um, exist, continue to exist, right? So the idea, you know, if someone, as soon as someone starts talking about no self, you know, the organism doesn't really like that um, because it feels like a threat to its existence, right? But the term no self doesn't mean, um, doesn't really mean that there's no sense of intimate um, I, right? It's just not where we thought it was. Right? So this is the difference in Ramanas where, you know, the little me, the small s self, you know, that's parked somewhere maybe in our head that we believe is present there. That's what's not true. But there is, what we realize is true is that there's still very much a sense of self. It's just housed in this um, infinite spaciousness of awareness. That's the big S self, right? It's still intimate. It's still I, right? It's just not a personal I. It's not limited to this body mind, even though this body mind is what is uh, in perceiving the environment that it happens to find itself. Right. The other thing that makes this difficult is that there is, we have this sense of continuity. And I suggest that it's based on primarily on memory. You know, we have this, we can remember our things of our past. We sort of ignore the blank periods that we can't remember, but we sort of intuit a continuity, a lifespan over a period of time, and that is associated with this body-mind. We can see this body-mind aging over a period of time, and therefore, because of this continuity, it feels like it has a solidity to it, and therefore, you know, it has a more of a sense of being than awareness may have at first glance, right? Awareness may feel a little bit tenuous compared to the solidity of, you know, decades of my personal history. Right? But when we really look at it, we can see that it's not really continuous at all. It's, we remember certain fragments along the way, a lot of blank spaces in there when we really go to look at it. And what I would suggest is that sense of continuity isn't really related to our memory, although that's what it feels like. It's really related to this awareness that is always present and unchanging. Right? One of the odd things about aging, and I used to hear, you know, older people say that. Now that I'm an older person, it feels like that. But it's a sense of, you know, the body's aging, sure, but there's a sense of something that's not aging. There's something. It's not a physical thing. it's not being in good health or not, but it's a sense of something that's unchanging from when we were little kids. So always sort of been there. It's always what I've called me. Um, but what I suggest it actually is the awareness itself, which is unchanging. Right? The awareness as today is as the awareness was decades ago. You know, what we know, how to function. Hopefully, that's changed, right? Everything has changed, but that awareness itself is still in its pristine state because it's not subject to form, right? So it's the one um, thing that we can sense into that is not subject to impermanence, not subject to creation and destruction. Body mind is, awareness not. Okay, so that I'd suggest that that is the source of that sense of continuity, rather than our memory or our achievements, etc. Um, so the last thing that I wanted to mention in terms of why it's challenging to sort of make the shift of identity, from a personal self to, let's say, spacious awareness, is that we can sort of look down and look at our body. It's here, it's solid. I can look inside and, the thoughts um, are present, feelings are present. So it feels very real, it's right here. But of course, that's what this organism feels. That's what it's able to do. It's able to look at itself. It's able to sense internally. It's able to be present for its thoughts, right? All of that's true. The only question is, what is aware of all of that? And again, the assumption is that because the awareness is present of these perceptions happening in this organism, therefore the awareness must be um, somehow um, limited or generated by this particular organism, right? That's the crux of the matter right there. So this whole movement from, life is impermanent, sure. Some impermanence, not a problem. Some impermanence we don't like because it has an effect on me, um, which is in service to the sense of um, personal well-being, some sense of this personal self needing to feel a certain way in order to be happy and at peace. But when we come down to it, we look for what exactly is this um, imagined, believed sense of personal self, um, and that possibility to see that our true identity is actually not that at all. It's just a misunderstanding. It's not like we're giving up a real entity. It's like we're giving up a misunderstanding in order to be what we actually are, which is much freer, much bigger, um, much more fun, actually. It's just this spacious awareness. But this movement can feel, we're hanging on so tightly to the sense of, yes, but I'm absolutely sure there must be a personal self in there. We're hanging on to that so tightly that the thought of that it doesn't actually exist feels so threatening, it can feel like a death. It can be imagined like a death. Not a physical death, a death of a belief is what it actually is. So there's several, sort of very specific sayings in very different religious traditions that point to exactly that. Um, the famous one in Sufism is die before you die so that you may truly live, right? The Gospel of Thomas, if you're familiar with that, it's one of the texts that was circulated in the early centuries after Christ that didn't make it into the published Bible, but has been recently discovered. It's not a storyline, it's just a series of quotes attributed to Jesus. And one of them is, whoever seeks to keep his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will preserve it. And then the last one here is from Lao Tzu, Taoist. To die, but not to perish, is to be eternally present. Right? To die, but not to perish, is to be eternally present. So what all of these very diverse religious traditions are talking about is clearly not physical death, right? Only that it has that sense of the extinguishment of an identity, a false identity, one that never actually existed, but it can feel so fundamental that what life looks like after that recognition of what we actually are feels like a rebirth, feels like a new life, to be born again, right? Then we get to learn how to live from that perspective.